I very often try to record videos in which I both address the controversy of the moment and deeper underlying questions, be they philosophical questions, political questions, or personal questions, so that this video would still be interesting to me if I came back and watched it 5 years from now when I've forgotten the controversy of the moment. For this video, the controversy of the moment is actually a discussion surrounding a book review I did some months ago, a negative book review, a book review that was both harsh and honest, and it raises for me a number of reasonably profound underlying issues, professional, political, personal, and otherwise, and philosophical. If we were to ask in the broadest sense, why be harsh in a review? And for this discussion, I'm not talking about being harsh for the sake of being harsh, which is kind of a dramatic art form here on YouTube, and definitely has been since the early pioneers of the art form, guys like The Amazing Atheist. They're often harsh for comical effect, or they really pretend to be angry when they're not angry, and this kind of thing. There's a lot of that goes on YouTube. It is what it is. I'm talking about the overlap between being honest and being harsh, where you're showing sincerely how you feel about something, not just in a dry intellectual way what you think about it. Of course, it's possible to imitate the advantages and disadvantages, the merits and the defects of academic writing here on YouTube. But I think it's really important and worthwhile to show how you feel, not just to talk about how you feel. And if a book is astoundingly awful, if it's surprisingly bad, to share your sense of surprise, your sense of astonishment, to share your sense of disappointment or how awful it was through the medium of YouTube. And that is indeed not something you can do in academic writing, especially not if you're somebody who's on the PhD treadmill. I'll come back to that in a moment. But this issue of harshness, interesting discussion broke out on Facebook with the contributors to ARZone writing to me. So ARZone, you could describe it as a magazine, you could describe it as a website, you can describe it as a podcast. It's all of these things. ARZone, the AR is abbreviating animal rights. So Animal Rights Zone. But it's a forum or a platform for discussions about veganism and animal rights advocacy, etc., as you can imagine. Anyway, they made two comments that are significant here. First, telling me, I emphasize the adjective most, that most of the criticism in my video, most of the criticism directed towards this book, that I say to myself, most of it came up in their own discussion of the book in a podcast, an interview that they did with the author of the book. Most. So I just want to emphasize this. When they say most of my criticism also came up in their discussion of the book, that's not a few points in common. That's not some points in common. That's not several points in common. That's most. So they said most of the negative points I made, they made themselves. And then I think a few hours later, they wrote to me again, the contributors to ARZone, and said, again, they understand and sympathize with the critique I presented. And however, even though these two contributors to ARZone, even though they presented similar concerns, similar objections, they did so in a respectful manner. Okay? So this is interesting. Why do I draw so much attention to this? Because the discussion on Facebook very much involved the author of the book himself. And the author of the book, who apparently had heard most of these criticisms before, but in a polite and not at all harsh forum from ARZone, when he heard those same criticisms again on my YouTube channel, he could not recognize them at all. They were new, shocking, unheard of, and he basically responded with a kind of denial. He went into a sort of denialism where he was claiming that I can't be serious, I must be a troll, I must just be trolling. This video must just be a joke or, not serious, or I must not know anything about true animal rights concepts. That was the way he put it. Well, why would he have such a dismissive reaction to this negative criticism if he had heard it stated plausibly and sincerely before. And again, my criticism is really sincere. I'm not trolling. And if he had heard it in this polite, sotto voce way from these other podcasters, these other internet broadcasters, however you want to put it. The reality is that it was only the harsh version of these same complaints that got through to him, right? When it wasn't harsh, even though it was presented to him directly in an interview format, he did not hear the criticism. And now he's hearing it a second time in a more honest and harsh form on my channel, and obviously he still really doesn't want to hear it. Now, one of the things I said back to him, and this comes to the nature of critique itself, whether in an academic context or in a religious context or a political context. Look, the vast majority of negative responses are just going to be expressed through silence. Most people, if they don't like a restaurant, are just going to walk out of the restaurant and not explain to the owner or the manager why they didn't like the restaurant. The vast majority of people who go to a Buddhist temple and have a negative experience are just going to walk out. They're not going to sit down and explain to the monks what was wrong with the Buddhist temple. And a very, very small number of people, I'm sticking with Buddhism for a reason here, because that's a religiously loaded situation. That's a situation of unequal authority. A very, very small number of people are going to actually challenge those authority figures. They certainly may have nothing to gain by challenging authority figures, and they may indeed have something to lose. They may indeed have a risk. I can tell you from experience just how difficult it is to sit down with Buddhist monks who think of themselves as authority figures and tell them just how wrong they are to refuse to offer tours and educational outreach to high school students at the Buddhist temple. So you're talking about Asian Buddhist monks living in Canada, and they don't see it as their responsibility or their role to do educational outreach in this form, which in Canada is very much linked to our school boards. The schools, they basically try to make the kids less sheltered, make them a little bit more cosmopolitan by taking them to Buddhist temples, Hindu temples, I think also very much, Muslim mosques, have them meet religious leaders and have a brief talk about the history of the religion, etc. This is actually a really important form of public outreach for Buddhism or for any of those groups in Canada. And if you've got Buddhist monks who are just with contempt dismissing the possibility of doing that, you got to sit down with them. And you can't just be polite. You can't just be obsequious. You can't just be oblique or indirect. You got to let them have it. You've got to be harsh, and you've got to be honest. And you've got to let them know the extent to which they are really fumbling a serious social obligation they have, both in terms of Canadian society and in terms of Buddhism as a religion itself. You can sit down and get out the scripture and let them know, hey, what would the Buddha do? And why does this temple even exist? And why are donors even giving you money? Those are really, really tough discussions to have. Another example from Buddhism, let's say somebody walks into a Buddhist temple, a parishioner, member of the temple, a Buddhist, and his wife has just died. So he's a widow, and he's heartbroken, and he's upset about this. And he walks around repeatedly trying to talk to a Buddhist monk. He wants counseling, to put it that way. And all the Buddhist monks just dismiss him or don't want to do with it. Or let's say, this would be typical, the monks just tell him to go and sit in a corner, go meditate on a mat, or even worse, maybe they just point him to one of the statues. They just tell him to worship one of the statues of the Buddha. This really happens. And you got to sit down, you're the person in the position to criticize the monks and say, look, we need to get set up, we need to get serious. If someone comes in and wants counseling, maybe there isn't a Buddhist monk available that minute, but somebody's got to respond with detachment and compassion and say, okay, we have a schedule. We can schedule an appointment for you to have some counseling with a Buddhist monk. These are not easy discussions to have. And my point is, 99% of these people, well, frankly 100%, they will just leave in silence. They will just be disappointed and walk out the door. They won't sit down and confront an authority figure this way. Okay? Come back to veganism, vegan politics, and in general, politicized issues within academia. I sit down to read this book with the most positive bias imaginable. I'm vegan. I want to like this book. I want to appreciate this book. I'm hoping that in this book I'm going to find useful tools for my own vegan activism that this book is going to be useful to me. I totally want to give this book a positive review. I have the most positive bias imaginable. And again, somebody who walks into a Buddhist temple, who's already a true believer in the Buddhist faith, has the most positive bias imaginable also, right? Most people who are disappointed with a book like this, just like somebody who's disappointed with the Buddhist temple and just walks out silently, they are not going to post a negative review on the internet. They're not going to confront the author or talk to the author. There is absolutely no reason to do that, and there's no reward for it, right? There may be a reward if you liked the book, sending the author an email or Facebook message saying, hey, I really appreciate your book. But he is not going to hear back from the people who are just disappointed and wander out of the temple. And remember, it's work to put together a case. It's not work. It's not hard for me to just be disappointed and walk out of the Buddhist temple, for me to just be disappointed with the book, put it down and stop reading it. But for me to gather my thoughts into a thesis, into a review, into a critique, and say, hey, here's what's wrong with the book. Now, in my review, for example, I don't just say the book is badly written and dismiss it, which you can do in a private conversation. I really explain to you why it's badly written, in what way it's badly written, and in what way that impairs or hampers the reader's experience, the reader's ability for this to be a useful or positive book, right? The guy who walks out of the Buddhist temple who's just upset, he really wanted to talk to a Buddhist monk. He wanted some kind of counseling. He wanted to hear some Buddhist philosophy after the death of his wife. This is a typical situation. These are real problems, And instead, he's just told to sit in the corner and meditate or sit in front of a statue or something. It would be really hard for him to set aside his feelings and in a disciplined and focused way put together a powerful critique of what that Buddhist temple is doing wrong and to say to them, hey, what would the Buddha do? How does this live up to or fail to live up to the ideals of Buddhist scripture and so on, right? Now, as stark and unequal as the relations of authority are within a Buddhist temple, in Western academia it's even worse. Many, many people on the internet who are outsiders to academia falsely assume that the world of people with PhDs sets a sort of gold standard for how we should engage in discourse, how we should engage in intellectual discussions, how we should engage in intellectual discussions or debates or book reviews, that kind of thing. And it really doesn't. I've lived my life surrounded by people with PhDs. I've lived a large part of my life in universities, and now ending up with a second bachelor's degree. It's the third bachelor's degree I've enrolled in, but my first bachelor's degree is in political science. And a lot of people with PhDs are miserable because the first thing they lose when they get a PhD, or even when they start the PhD process, when they get on the PhD track, they lose the freedom of speech to really be honest about the things that matter to them most, to be honest about the things that probably motivated them to get involved with academia in the first place. Once you're on the PhD treadmill, you're part of a culture that rewards false praise, hollow praise, and that tries to force you to engage in snide, oblique, and indirect criticism instead of really honest and open discussion. So the academic literature does not present a gold standard for this. And on the contrary, during my years as a scholar of Buddhism, which is maybe approximately 10 years, many, many times people with PhDs told me that they envied me. Again, this is not my imagination. It's not me saying I felt they envied me. They directly told me to my face or an email that they envied me because they wished they could engage in the Buddhist intellectual realm with the kind of freedom of speech, put it that way, that I had, that they could be incisive and critical and what have you, without having to fear the consequences of, frankly, punishment from their PhD supervisor or being regarded as unemployed by the very small hothouse of people who earn their living out of having opinions about Buddhism and who very much live in a social context where people in glass houses can't throw stones and this kind of thing. I think that's enough for this video. I'm delighted that this is under 15 minutes. But to be honest with you, those deeper underlying issues about the contrast between being both honest and harsh and the sort of very insincere and oblique mode of expression that Western academia tends to cultivate or tends to force people to adhere to, that is really a deep and meaningful topic for me to reflect on. It's a topic I've had to reflect on in many different ages and stages of my life. And the bottom line is I'd ask you to reflect and ask yourself, who are your intellectual heroes? either in the real world or in fiction. And I think you're going to find that the people who are really honest and who are really harsh at the same time, being both honest and harsh, whether in a comedic way or in a really sincere, down-to-earth way, I don't think that your intellectual heroes, within any given field, whether it's Buddhist studies or sociology or anthropology or politics, I really doubt that your heroes are the people who express their criticism in an oblique, coded, snide, indirect way that only other specialists can pick up on in the midst of writing false praise and flattery. And on the other hand, as this example shows, that culture of false praise, flattery, and polite criticism, it does not get through to the authors themselves. In this case, it was just ignored by the author. And I do not think it serves any positive purpose for the audience themselves. I think the audience is going to appreciate and enjoy your honesty. And even within veganism, we see it's figures like Gary Francione. He has many defaults. There are defects in his approach. He's not perfect, but he is honest. It's people like Gary Yourofsky. I'm a real critic of both of these guys. I'm a critic of both Francione and Yourofsky. Guys like Yourofsky, they're over the top, they're honest, they're engaged, they're sincere, they're emotionally honest, and they're being intellectually honest with you, however grave the defects in their approach may be. Those are the people who I think reach an audience, serve an audience, and where the audience can learn from their example for better and worse, the good and the bad of it. And nobody is served by the kind of studious, focused dishonesty that's rewarded within PhD programs. I'm out.